I want to talk about something that's pretty standard, pretty known, but go into a little bit more detail, and that is keeping your knife sharp. Obviously, that's an important thing for any uh, knife craft, any type of carving and woodworking. But I want to give three specific examples of when that makes a particularly big difference in chip carving. So, if you're doing this kind of standard medium size three-sided chip, you can probably get away with a knife that's not perfectly sharp and be fine with it. But the three situations that I find having a particularly sharp knife and keeping it very sharp really matters is with very fine chips like this, very large chips like this, and going against the grain chips. So in other videos I talk about wanting to switch over and move direction, reverse direction, so that you can always be carving with the grain. But sometimes the chip itself switches grain direction, so you can see like this crescent shape here. It goes with the grain in this direction, but then it switches and goes against the grain in this direction. And so when you're going to end up having to go against the grain, is very, very helpful to have a sharp knife. So kind of explaining back now through why it matters. With really fine detailed chips like this, you're removing such a small portion of the wood that the grain becomes a very substantial aspect. The size of the grain compared to the size of the chip becomes really big. And so you want to make sure that the grain itself is not causing any issues, that the knife is able to just kind of slice through the grain very effortlessly. Because if you end up having to crush the grain or tear the grain at all on this kind of a small scale, it's going to become much more noticeable than on a larger chip that isn't quite as detailed or quite as delicate. So you can see there, almost no pressure, just lightly dragging. It's almost etching, but in the wood, but it is kind of that two-sided V-cut to do that. And if I had the knife catching at all, especially since this is curvy and does change grain direction, that would be challenging to do with a dull knife. The next one with big chips is just the more wood you have, the more force you have to put into it, the more resistance there is, and the thickness of the blade is wedging itself against the wood the deeper you push it in. So you really don't want any additional resistance coming from the edge. As you're pulling, you don't want it pushing back that way. And again, a clean, very sharp edge is going to just slice through and cut through that wood fiber a lot easier. So I do recommend for large chips taking out relief cuts first, but even still, with such large cuts, you don't want to have to worry about the resistance of the wood as you're making long removals like that. So again, the sharpness just really makes it a lot easier, not only to make the cut at all, but to get good results in the cut. So the last one then is for these chips that the single chip crosses grain direction, and there's some other technique to this style of chip besides just a sharp knife. It won't do all the work for you, but again, I don't think you can really get as good of results if your knife isn't basically as sharp as you can. So here it's all fine, but now I'm going with the grain and it's going to start switching. And so for here, to keep the knife moving smoothly, I can just move the board under the knife, and because it's sharp, it'll continue cutting, and I get a nice smooth transition. I don't have any ripping. I don't have the knife trying to continue along the grain in this direction like it would if it were dull. That light pressure of rotating the board underneath the knife allows it to continue cutting in that very smooth manner. And for something like this, I could cut. I'll do another example here. It is an option. I could come in and just carve to the grain and then switch this way, but that's pretty tricky to get it to line up perfectly between those two cuts. You can see, I've got a bit of wood kind of popping up there, and then there's a line. So that's really hard to make those two line up. It's much better if you can just do one smooth cut all the way across. So I recommend, don't just stop with sharpening on the sharpening stones. If you don't have one, definitely get a leather strop like this with some compound to rub on it. And I recommend probably stropping it, give it maybe 20, 30 strops back and forth, like every 15 minutes. That way you can keep it perfectly sharp the whole time you're carving. I know it's hard for me to stop when I'm getting into the groove of carving, and I don't want to stop to strop, but it definitely is worth it to make sure that the carving is consistently clean and you get good results throughout the course of your carving session. So maybe set a timer during your carving to remind you to stop and tune up the edge of your knife every 15 minutes or so. In the fitness world, there's a saying that says you can't out-train a bad diet. What that means is it doesn't matter how many days a week you work out, how long you go for a run, that if the way you're eating isn't sufficient for the type of results that you're looking for, you're not going to get there. That you need to have both a good training schedule, but also a good habit of how you eat and your diet to support that. And I would apply that to this idea of carving as you can't out-carve a dull knife. And so what I mean there is it doesn't matter how good of a carver you are, if the tool you're using is dull, you're never going to be able to overcome that with skill. That there's certain things that the knife has to do the work for you of actually cutting the wood. And if it's not capable of doing that, then it's going to hold you back and you're not going to get the results that you want. So that's not to say necessarily that every time something goes wrong, or if you're not getting what you like, that the problem is necessarily the knife and you need to strop for a half hour straight to get the edge 1 atom thick or anything. But it is something to keep in mind that if you start getting tearing grain, or you get jagged edges or rough cuts on the inside of your chips, then one thing might be to consider stropping your knife or checking its sharpness. You might have to go back to a sharpening stone depending on where it is. So something to keep in mind, but not necessarily run to blaming. Having a dull knife will prevent beginner carvers from being able to progress very well, because they don't necessarily know if it's something they're doing wrong or if the knife just isn't doing its job. And for advanced carvers, if you're doing more difficult cuts, like large ones or these other things that I've gone around, then it's going to hinder that, and you might end up ruining some projects or something with ripped out wood, or again some of the jagged edges on the inside. So keep that in mind. You can out-carve a dull knife. Keep your knife sharp. Make sure that it's not the weak link in the chain of your carving abilities.